Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Dan Sampaio from Mondac, and today is the first of our exciting Spring 2023 Future Series events in partnership with McMillan LLP and the Canadian Corporate Counsel Association. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce you to a terrific duo today with two legal experts joining us from McMillan, William Pellerin and Neil Campbell. William Pellerin is a partner in McMillan LLP's International Trade Group and serves as co-lead of McMillan's sanctions team and advises numerous Fortune 500 companies on complex sanction matters. He is acting in some of Canada's highest profile and mediatized economic sanctions matters. As former Deputy Director, Trade Remedies and North America Trade with Global Affairs Canada, William oversaw international trade disputes and appeals and coordinated Canada's response to such actions. Neil Campbell is one of Canada's preeminent international trade and competition lawyers, serving as co-lead of McMillan's sanctions team and co-chair of its international trade group. His 30 years of trade law experience includes numerous anti-dumping and subsidy proceedings, as well as advising on WTO and other international trade agreements, representing clients on exports, import controls and economic sanctions matters, foreign corrupt practices and investor-state disputes under trade and investment treaties. Now, before I hand over to William and Neil to begin today's webinar, a housekeeping item. You can submit questions to our panel by typing them into the questions pane of the toolbar on the right-hand side of your page. The panel will endeavour to answer as many questions as possible during our Q&A session at the end of today's presentations. It's now my pleasure to hand you over to William and Neil to begin. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's well. It's very nice to have you here, and thank you, Dan. And maybe I'll just launch right away into the next slide. We have a lot to cover today, and as Dan mentioned, the quicker we can get through it, the faster we can get to your questions. So by way of agenda, very quickly here, we're going to do a bit of a sanctions lay of the land. We're going to be quite brief in terms of the overall legal framework. I think by now, more than a year since Russia's further invasion of Ukraine, many of you and your companies are sophisticated, have processes and procedures in place. And so the goal here today is not to go through, this is Section 3 of the Special Economic Measures, Russia regulations, and here's what it does. We're really focused down in the weeds of compliance and what we do with this level of sophistication going forward. So we're going to be talking about effective screening and monitoring programs, responding to sanctions violations, general tenets of sanctions compliance, sanctions enforcement from the Canadian perspective and what that has looked like and could look like. We will talk about the new control provisions that are currently before the House of Commons and talk about general recent updates to sanctions regime. Next slide, please. So this is our handy dandy quick glance map of current sanctioned countries that provides an overview of the various legislations and sanctions that Canada has imposed up until now. Many of you sanctions nerds like us will already have identified potentially that there is a mistake in this map. And by that, I mean it is not yet current, and by that, so take 3 seconds to spot it for those of you that want to do that. And of course, the answer is that Moldova is not yet shaded. Moldova was sanctions with respect to Moldova were added 1 week ago under the Special Economic Measures Moldova regulations that are brand new as of last week. Then I've listed the number of statutes under which sanctions can occur in Canada. And I think I'll just leave it at that and we'll continue moving forward. Next slide, please. At a very high level, of course, many of the key considerations as you're issue spotting in terms of sanctions compliance, you're first of all looking to your nexus to Canada. We're always talking about persons in Canada, whether Canadian or not. That's entities and individuals. And we are referring also to Canadians outside Canada, which is an important reminder here, because very often, at least what I'm seeing in my practice, is issues relating to Canadian employees abroad that may be working out of Switzerland, for example, or transacting in Russian oil or something of the sort. And very important to understand the impact of sanctions on those persons as well. But it's also a key reminder that Canada doesn't generally have extraterritorial applications of its sanctions measures, unlike, for example, the United States, which stretches outside of the borders further. We're often dealing in property. That's the general prohibitions, and we're talking about here dealing in property, and what that means is transacting writ large, everything that falls under that with respect to property of listed or designated persons. And we're talking about ownership, holding, or controlling such property. And we're going to talk further about how those terms are defined and how they are changing under Canadian law. There are, of course, a number of facilitation provisions that prohibit helping, assisting, facilitating others in the dealings, for example, of in property. And then there's a whole gamut of other prohibitions that go far beyond, particularly with respect to Canada's Russian sanctions, the dealing in property. So there are prohibitions on provision of services to various Russian industries, for example, mining services, accounting, various others. There are prohibitions on the exports to various countries, prohibitions on imports as well. And those go far beyond military equipment, for example. There are numerous provisions regulating the exports of luxury goods to Russia, for example. There are numerous provisions on the export of what they're calling arms or munitions, which include such things as dentist chairs and gauzes and bandages and x-ray machines and so on and so forth. And then there's the prohibition on ships docking or entering into Canadian waters where there's that nexus to Russia. So we'll pass along again quickly on this front and move to the next slide, please. So getting a bit into the meat of things here, we've talked about the different ways to issue spot, but the most important part of your sanctions compliance regime will be screening. And screening for individuals and entities, on the one hand, of course, screening for other issues such as a service prohibition is kind of a separate piece entirely. But I think there's kind of a generally recognized three-step model that comes highly recommended from various sources, including from our team, where you move trade compliance and sanctions compliance specifically into the core fabric, into the core business of your companies. And the idea here is to integrate it into the daily lives of those that are doing sales or procurement or supplying. Now, this model, of course, doesn't apply to every type of industry. Moving sanctions compliance to the cashier at Walmart, for example, doesn't make sense and is not necessary. But in the general course of things at banks or financial institutions and a number of other entities where you're selling more complicated goods internationally, the idea here is your frontline sales gathers this information, gathers in, and runs the sanctions screening tool. And here, many of you and many of our clients, most of them in fact, use various commercial software tools. There are a number of very good ones out there. just to name a few. Of course, Dow Jones, S&P, Bloomberg, and so on and so forth. And at this point, these commercial tools, and we'll discuss them further, run what is known, of course, as fuzzy searches. And many of you will be very familiar with this idea, but the concept here is that you allow for the searching across all different types of spelling or permutations in the names of listed individuals. So you're generating a lot more hits because the most important thing is to not miss something. So it's okay to go extremely broadly and catch all the different permutations. This is particularly important with Russia, where you're dealing often with names in Cyrillic, and so you want to make sure that the translations capture it. And then what you do is escalate all of those hits to your actual trade compliance team. And so that's your internal trade compliance folks. You're considering at this level all of the non-list based sanctions. The trade compliance folks are responsible for the idea of the services prohibitions and the import and exports of goods. And the third step is that further escalation of problematic situations. So the level 2 compliance team, for example, would be able to rule out all of those easy false positives where the commercial software has triggered something, but of course it's obviously not relevant. But when it is relevant, then you escalate that internally and bring in external legal counsel at that point. Often, that's often when we are brought in, for example. Next slide, please. So in terms of sanctions screening, and we'll talk about an example here that I like, but the most important thing and one of the big pitfalls that we see is that folks do not understand how their commercial screening software actually works. And we're going to talk about that a little bit, particularly in the case of the sanctions enforcement action against MidFirst Bank in the United States. But the idea is I would strongly recommend that you make sure that you do understand what's being searched and when are the lists updated. And then testing your level 2 and level 3 risk escalation processes and making sure that you understand that you audit your own internal processes. At a very high level, of course, playing ostrich with the risks and burying your head in the sand is not going to work. It's not the right approach in today's day and age, especially as sanctions enforcement globally ramps up. And while Canada is still slow on the enforcement, we do know that enforcement actions are in the works, investigations are in the works. We're hearing this from the RCMP, including at the House of Commons Committee last week. So we expect that things are going to escalate quite quickly. Next slide, please. So this leads us to the example that I was talking about earlier, and I raise it because it's a very good reminder for companies that not understanding what your commercial tool does, it can lead to problems. And often we're at a stage where a lot of companies think that just by paying someone or outsourcing, a lot of the problems go away, and that's not always the case. So in terms of sanction screening, MidFirst Bank is a good example. This is a case that happened in the US where OFAC issued a notice of violation last year. So what happened here is that OFAC had added some names to the list, some new sanctioned entities, and MidFirst thought that its commercial tool rescreened all of its accounts every day. But that wasn't the case. What the tool did is it only screened going forward, and every month it would screen back to account for everything, all new sanctions. So it screened once a month. So basically it happened by mid-month. Say they had, I think, about 14 days of period of time where they hadn't caught the new persons that were designated, and many transactions went through during that period by the newly sanctioned persons. So they, of course, and you can just imagine the horror internally when they realized this, and did everything right from that moment. They cooperated with OFAC, they reported it, and there were numerous mitigating factors, of course. It was a little bit of a mistake, but they reported it quite quickly. They hadn't previously been caught or found guilty of any type of penalties, and so this was a notice of violation, but no financial penalties associated with it. Next slide, please. So in terms of the required disclosure in Canada, we all know that the disclosure is required. It's without delay to the RCMP. In some cases, for example, under the Iran regulations, you can make the disclosure to CSIS. The important part here, for those of you that don't yet know, is that Canada does not operate on a strict liability regime, meaning there must be some willfulness to the violation or some sort of willful blindness level here. So having your due diligence processes in place, strong processes and policies can help, of course, if any charges are ever laid. And those charges can lead to, of course, very serious consequences, including jail time. As is always the case, these voluntary and prompt disclosures are generally viewed quite favorably and can certainly be mitigating factors when it comes to penalties. Next slide, please. And then perhaps one last example here of an entity that responded well to sanctions violations, and this is also a US example, is Microsoft. Very recently, 2 months ago, realized that it had to disclose or make a voluntary self-disclosure of violations both to the US BIS and to OFAC, where millions of dollars of software and services were sent to listed and sanctioned entities over a long period of time. Basically, there wasn't IP searching. It was allowing various people in certain sanctioned countries to register the product. And once they discovered this, they, of course, went immediately to OFAC and BIS. And the penalty, while significant, is relatively low in the grand scheme, especially compared to numerous others in the United States. And again, the idea of the voluntary disclosure and the cooperation, the termination of the accounts, and the going forward changes to the sanctions compliance program were very important here. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague, Neil Campbell, who will take you through the tenets of sanctions compliance. Thanks.
Thanks, William. Thanks, Dan and Mondak. Good morning or afternoon, everybody, depending where you are. I want to just step back. I think that many of you will be compliance professionals or concerned, legal professionals concerned with how you deal with an area like this that historically was a bit of a sleeper area, I think, in Canada. To be fair to say, it really, the Ukraine conflict has changed that substantially for the Canadian government, and as a result, I think really up the ante for companies of all types to make sure that sanctions compliance is one of those things that you have properly in hand. I think it's a twofold rationale. One, as William just said, is if you get in trouble, a well-developed, well-implemented compliance effort is a key part of lenient treatment, whether that's not being prosecuted or negotiating your way to a modest resolution. It's also, before you get to that, your best defense against having problems. So it's an investment decision like any other compliance activity. I think of compliance in a sort of a five-part framework. I'll just touch briefly on how one can think about sanctions compliance in that context. I think it does start with senior management commitment. Everybody is able to get the CEO or the COO or the CFO or the CLO to say that compliance is important and please pay attention. I think the key thing that is a challenge in all areas, including sanctions, is how do we ensure that the senior management team across the whole leadership of the organization is actually walking that talk. It needs to be the case that paying attention to whether you are in compliance with Canada and other countries' sanction rules in the course of regular transacting, in the course of importing, exporting, financial transactions, etc., is part of something that people are expected to proactively be dealing with when they're running the business and carrying on the business. The second piece is typically done by way of formal policy statement, procedure statements. Williams talked a little bit about sort of a three-tier approach for doing that with different levels within the organization to triage things from initial recognition through analysis and ultimately the difficult cases that require some deliberated decision-making. From my point of view, the key in this step is ensuring that you have your audiences comprehensively covered. The audience can be fairly broad for that first broad swath of issue recognition, of ensuring that initial screening checks are done with the tools you choose to be using. Then I think there is a more specific level of guidance around the people who are actually doing the analytics. And those are two different levels, perhaps, of written policy and guidance. The training, I think, needs to reflect the same thing. You're training for a broad range of first frontline personnel, be they sales, be they procurement, be they other people in relevant parts of your organization, can probably most naturally, most efficiently be done using an online kind of basic training. The training for the person or persons who may form that smaller, more detailed compliance assessment type team that are doing the work on individual situations that need analysis, probably, as with most types of compliance, benefit from real in-person training and having that refreshed on a periodic basis. That's where you get the opportunity to really suss out how do we actually deal with stuff like figuring out whether some designated entity or person controls or doesn't control some particular property or entity that we're transacting with, and so on. The last two I just mentioned for completeness. The monitoring process is something that people often don't pay much attention to. In the sanctions context, I think one of the things you'd want to be testing in that three-part or three-level triaging model is, whether you're actually seeing those initial identification of issues and referral up to the next level for more detailed assessment. That's something that can be sort of periodically monitored. At the second level, the assessment level, you're probably dealing with a small enough number of situations that there is room for your internal controls or compliance professionals, or occasionally an outside check, to take a look at some particular cases and to see whether indeed they're being comprehensively, properly dealt with. And the last piece is the hardest piece, which is for people who aren't following the program, there need to be consequences. It isn't always termination, but there need to be measured, appropriate, but real consequences, and the organization needs to perceive that is the case. It's essentially a carrot and stick approach ultimately to an area like this. And this is a technical area, and one in which particularly in that middle assessment zone, there are opportunities to look the other way. There are opportunities, or there are risks of there being business pressure to do transactions that should in fact be not done. And those are the challenges, I think, as you try to drive compliance into this type of a functional area. Next slide, please. Just a quick, a very partial set of statistics on designated persons. The basic message here is massive proliferation since the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, and the Russia and Ukraine and Belarus sanctions all now have very large numbers of people. Again, a good commercial tool will be tracking and keeping up with the fact that this is an evolving target. Next slide, please. The government has started to publish some information on frozen assets and block transactions. My own sense is this is not as large numbers as one might have expected. I think in part vis-a-vis the sort of Russia-Ukraine situation, they probably had a fair bit of learning back from the initial Crimea events in 2014, vis-a-vis Canada, but also internationally, leading a number of people who might have been at risk of being designated and might now be designated to organize their affairs to avoid some of the countries that are active sanctioners, including Canada, the US, and so on. I think there's probably also a fairly significant amount of underreporting. I think a lot of companies still not rigorously familiar with the reporting and disclosure obligations that William talked about earlier. Next slide, please. Not a ton of historic cases to report in Canada, unlike, for example, OFAC in the US, which has been very, very prominent in doing cases and getting very large penalties. But you can get a large penalty for what may be a small transgression. The Lee case is an example here. The point that William made earlier, I think, is the most notable one, that we really have moved from a very low profile, probably low priority area of economic regulatory enforcement into one that is now seen as a materially important area for the government, and one that is politically important, not just important in a technical sense. And we see that in terms of the number of announcements and activity and support that the government is channeling in this area. What that will lead to is gradual complaint, investigation, detection, eventually prosecution, all of this being done in a criminal legal framework. So it takes time for these cases to mature into prosecutions and decided cases. There's no doubt that that is the trend, albeit starting from a small base. Next slide, please. One of the other areas we see that government commitment to this activity is in the early responses to some judicial review applications challenging or attempting to challenge the way in which the government is making decisions to list people into the Canadian sanctions, or the way in which the government is dealing with people seeking to be delisted. So there obviously is a process available for someone who feels they're not properly designated to seek a delisting. Early returns in terms of judicial review cases in which we see the government approach to these issues is vigorous defense of the breadth of the discretion of the government decision makers, and a view that relatively modest procedural fairness standards are applicable. Obviously, the courts in due course will sort through those issues, and we may see some greater discipline brought to bear in terms of how those decision-making processes work. Again, at this point in time, I think what it shows is government is prepared to be aggressive on initial listings, and government is cautious and not particularly fast in responding to applications to delist. Next slide, please. Canada actually became really an international leader in announcing its new so-called seizure and forfeiture regime. So the typical sanctions process is to freeze or to block, freeze assets, property, block transactions, and essentially create a set of incentives for designated persons, but ultimately for problematic regimes to be encouraged to change behavior. That often takes a long time, but in theory, at the end of such a process, if sanctions get to a stage where they can be removed, as they are from time to time, a person then can resume dealing in frozen assets, and you can have transactions occur in the future that have been blocked for a period of time. The seizure, restraint, and forfeiture regime is really a sea change in the sense of saying, while we have property that is frozen, we, the Government of Canada, now have an explicit statutory authority to go in and seize it or restrain it, i.e. issue an order that it cannot be dealt with, essentially formalizing what would have been the obligation of the person who was holding the property that is subject to a freeze or a block. The government was quite vocal when it announced the first case, and we could go to the next slide just to have a look at that example. It's an example that was announced just before Christmas last year. It is a restraint order issued by the Cabinet against Citco Bank Canada. It's based on allegations that there's ownership by a designated person, Mr. Abramovich, and it's a little bit unusual to see regular economic regulatory enforcement activity being done with accompanying announcements by cabinet ministers. But Mr. Joly was very much vocal in identifying this as an important new Canadian step in the international efforts to try to increase the pressure from sanctions that are Ukraine related, and the basic stepping up here is the ability to go through a process that may achieve a forfeiture of the property that the Canadian government then has the ability to redeploy to the benefit of, for example, the Ukraine in this context. Let's go to the next slide, please. I want to just end with a little bit of a discussion about what I think is the most challenging area to deal with in terms of figuring out whether you have property and transactions that may get swept into the Canadian sanctions regime and need to be dealt with through freezes and blocks and disclosures and so on. The designated persons are a long list of individual people and entities. One of the challenges in a practical context when you are doing transactions is figuring out whether the person or entity you are dealing with is going to be property that is owned or controlled by a designated person. So it's not sufficient just to find the designated persons on the list. It's important to be able to ascertain whether proposed financial transactions or imports or exports or whatever the transactions you may be doing may be dealing with property that is owned or controlled by a designated person. And that can get you into some fairly complex and often outside, almost always outside of Canada, ownership and control arrangements that need to be assessed as best you can for purposes of understanding your obligations if you are a Canadian person or company, or a person or company in Canada that is subject to our sanctions regime. The Anglophora case is a little bit odd in that it's not a prosecution case. It happens to be a private parties dispute where one of the parties in the context of an arbitration award says that essentially Canadian sanctions would prevent dealing in particular property or transaction, and leads the court in Alberta into really the first jurisprudential assessment of what ownership and control may mean under our regime. For present purposes, not going to spend very much time on the facts of the case. The interesting issue was whether an ownership interest of 50% by Gazprom Bank was or wasn't going to bring the sanctions regime into play. And as you'll see in a moment when we talk a little bit more detail about which countries are using what kinds of tests, the U.S. uses essentially a 50% test that triggers the ownership control finding. And the court was receptive to that, and also was receptive to looking at essentially some of the sort of control and fact considerations that might be indicators of a degree of actual control. That is sort of where we are sitting at the moment. Next slide, please, talks about Bill C-47, which is the Canadian government's latest effort to, again, sort of up the level of regulatory activity and impact that they're able to have in the sanctions space. And Bill C-47 has a number of proposed amendments and is working its way through Parliament. I'm going to focus just on one, although William may touch about it a little bit more generally later on. What Bill C-47 proposes to do with respect to this ownership and control issue is to really create a broad deeming provision that will go probably beyond what most people would consider to be the current meaning of ownership and control. We're in a strange world at the moment where, with the exception of Angophora, there is no real guidance, and people are making judgments around ownership and control tests in the CIMA framework. The deemed new provision has three parts. One is it will institutionalize that 50% test that I referred to, that was looked at in Angophora as a U.S. point of reference, and will make that a simple and automatic determination of ownership control. But in addition, parts B and C are going to greatly expand that concept. Part B, the person is able directly or indirectly to change the composition or powers of the entity's board of directors. So that is a little bit vague, but definitely trending in the broad direction. In particular, for example, in a privately held context, if you have the right to appoint a director, even if you are a minority shareholder, it would appear that you would be a person who could change the composition of the entity's board of directors. And in all sorts of private situations, that may well be now a factor that would tip you to control type of finding. Very difficult in a practical sense to fully investigate this, because you're going to be dealing with foreign entities where it may be difficult to understand the actual governance arrangements in an entity that your company may be prepared to transact with, and are they or are they not ultimately a company where a designated person has that kind of now deemed ownership control. And the third testing, part C, reasonable to conclude a little bit of an objective standard, but the rest of it is pretty broad, having regard to all the circumstances. So some implication that companies in Canada subject to the CIMA regime need to be attentive to and finding information about the relevant circumstances. that the person is able directly or indirectly through any means to be able to direct the entity's activities. That, roughly speaking, sounds like a broad version of a control in fact test. Next slide, please. Just to sort of summarize where Canada will be in a Bill C-47 enacted environment, which could be soon. Across the top, the sort of ownership or shareholding, ownership interest element of the test. The UK a little bit different in using a more than 50% test, but Canada trending in with the US EU approach to 50% or more being sufficient as a first trigger. And these are alternative triggers. You don't need any one of them is sufficient to get to deemed control. In that second, able to change composition or powers of the board, you'll see Canada will be much broader than anybody else. The UK and the EU have board-based tests, but are focused on majority of the board kind of perspective, which is more intuitive and more consistent with what people would generally think as a control concept. This, I think, is one of the big risk area challenges in compliance. People will think ownership and control means more than 50% or might mean 50% and more, or might mean the majority of the board. And we will have Canada in a world where a lot less than that can nonetheless trigger this kind of a control finding. And the third, as I said, is control in fact, finding again, Canada getting much broader than the US, a little bit different than the UK and the EU in respect of that element. It would have been, from the point of view of how often this stuff crosses borders, much easier if Canada had, for example, moved to just align itself with the US regime and or worked harder to maximize compliance or coordinate alignment with the other key allies. That is my contribution to a bit of an effort to look at key compliance issues in this context. William, back to you.
Thanks, Neil. And we can leave it at that slide, actually. Dan, if you can just go back for 1 second, just for a bit of color commentary here, and maybe even some homework for some of the attendees here. The court, the Alberta Court of King's Bench, per Neil's comments, talked about Angophora being effectively controlled by a sanctioned entity, in that case, Gazprom Bank. Very curious to see those of you that have commercial software, commercial tools, whether you've tested and put Angophora in to see whether it would raise some red flags for you. You know, we have the one court decision in Canada that says Angophora is effectively controlled by a sanctioned entity. What does your commercial software tool say about that when you put Angophora? Does it actually come up as a sanctioned entity or an entity that is controlled by one? Something for you to test, certainly. And then the next question is how your commercial tools might actually even go about this idea of testing for the ability to change the composition of the boards. And I think it's frankly a fair question to ask your service providers to see how they think they might be able to run some tests, whether it's through some analysis of especially for public companies, if the shares are very widely distributed, but someone has X percentage of those shares, right? Like if someone has 10% shareholding and is by far the largest shareholder in that company, they may well be, of course, able to change the composition or the powers of the board. So I'm very curious to see what your service provider says and what might come up if you searched an entity that we think may well be sanctioned as a result of this change to the legislation. Next slide, please. So that leaves us now departing the ownership and control world and just talking generally about recent updates to the legislation and the lay of the land. And I think one of the most quickly changing environments relates to the intersection, the growing intersection between sanctions and anti-money laundering. And we're seeing this with the repo task force, the Russian elites, proxies, and oligarchs, the G7 task force, and their various global advisories, which talk about the topologies of Russian sanctions evasion. There's discussion of further use of real estate to shield and hide assets. There are greater discussions of the use of intermediaries and nominees to purchase, whether it be real estate or something else, above or below market value. There's greater discussions of non-resident banking in traditional tax havens, the use of trust to obfuscate transactions, and all sorts of things that change the risk profile and really should be causing many of you to reevaluate the various risks that you're dealing with. Another example that comes to mind here, just from something I've been dealing with personally recently, is the idea of freight forwarding businesses being in third countries being listed as the final destination of a good, right? If the final destination of the good that you are shipping is a freight forwarder in Kazakhstan, I would strongly urge caution and further diligence before shipping that good. So these are the types of things that we're seeing on a regular basis now, and certainly raising red flags for a number of our clients. Next slide, please. And here we're now talking about recent updates, but with respect to Global Affairs Canada. Many of you will be aware of increased funding that has been announced, or was announced actually last year, that we're starting to see percolate through for the creation of a sanctions bureau at Global Affairs Canada. We are told that they will move from 10 to 15 employees to significantly more. I think I heard 45 in the House of Commons committee recently. As a former employee at Global Affairs Canada for many years, I will believe it when I see it, but that may take quite a few years to ramp up, and more importantly to train up new employees, because throwing a number of additional bodies at the problem is not going to solve it. We're also continuing to await guidance, long promised guidance from Global Affairs Canada. Many of you will know that unlike nearly all jurisdictions, Global Affairs Canada does not provide guidance on the interpretation of the sanctions regime. We're really operating as a bit of a third world country when it comes to the transparency of the overall regime, and of course ownership and control is one of those points that would benefit significantly from guidance, and frankly, as we pointed out to Global Affairs Canada officials, would significantly reduce the number of permit applications that have been filed. We're now in the I'm told 500 plus pending permit applications that are in the backlog. I, to use some of my examples, have some, while some may be granted relatively quickly, and we're talking here in a matter of weeks, couple months, others are now approaching 1 year plus. So, before you apply for permits to do something that would otherwise trigger the various prohibitions, you have to think twice, and in many cases, we're advising that it's simply not worth it. So that's two very key updates. Perhaps one additional thing that I'll point out is that Global Affairs Canada is at least becoming faster when it comes to updating the various consolidations when they publish new regulations, but nonetheless, a lot of these are slow. And one of the things that we do, for example, for our clients is we prepare our own consolidations of the various regulations. And this, our clients find, supplements very well the various commercial tools and allows them to double check what's happening and make sure that they're up to date. So I think there's a lot of companies and a lot of law firms have their own workarounds, and we do as well. Next slide, please. And this is our last slide, and I think it's just to kind of reiterate how the lay of the land is changing. We are seeing that trade compliance, different elements within the concept of trade compliance are merging together to a greater extent than ever before. Now, I talked a little bit about the intersection between sanctions and anti-money laundering earlier. Anti-corruption fits in there. We're seeing, of course, new legislation on forced labor in the supply chains with the passage of S211 and the mandatory reporting requirements, but also the bans on goods made from child labor and forced labor. That's all folding into, because we're seeing it from, for example, the Chinese sanctions, the special economic measures, China regulations, various listed entities that are involved in the alleged use of forced labor in China, for example. So, and the type of diligence that you'd be doing on your supply chains, on your suppliers, on your customers, all folds back into the same type of diligence that you could be doing on the sanctions front. Export controls, of course, while being dealt with at a different division within Global Affairs Canada, and with CBSA, merges very clearly into the sanctions context. So there's certainly, as Neil was mentioning earlier, media scrutiny. We're starting to see enforcement actions. There is the level of political engagement on sanctions is extremely high. I think the government, frankly, wants to make a show of bringing enforcement actions in the very near term to show that this is not just about, adding new names to various lists and doing nothing further than that. So the environment continues to change, and a lot of that is being brought about by our allies as well that are continuing to move forward. So I think as you reform and improve on your internal processes and policies, it bears remembering these kind of 5 elements that are moving forward in sync. And with that, next slide, please. This brings us to our question and answer.
Excellent. Thank you very much, William, and thank you, Neil. Really fascinating presentations there. As William says, we will now move on to our Q&A session. And I do encourage our audience to please send in any questions that you may have, and we've had a few in already. I will start with this question. What is the likelihood that the definition of deemed ownership in the Draft Budget Implementation Act C-47, which you discussed, will be amended before it is enacted? And Neil, if I hand over to you for that one, thank you.
I think that it is certainly possible, but not very likely. And I think it's very likely that we will see that legislation moved through quickly, all subject to the fact that there are larger considerations in politics that sometimes change legislative timetables. I think there is certainly input being provided to the government and Parliament that there are some current concerns with that test, so it is conceivable that a little bit of refinement would be done, but it does seem to be moving steadily and quickly forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Our second question, you raised one model of compliance, the three-step process with frontline employees, such as those in sales doing a first scan for sanctions. What other models may be appropriate?
Yeah, I can jump on this one. I think it's just important to consider your own risk profile in anything that you do. Of course, if you are an entity that has very little international transactions, the transactions that you do on an international basis are with the United States or Mexico based. I think your risk profile with respect to sanctions may be quite low. You may not need to front load and give all of your different frontline people access to a commercial search tool. And you may simply have a bit more of a robust trade compliance team that runs some scans in the background in a perhaps more siloed way, rather than distributed across the organization. So I think understanding the various risks, and in that sense, that's why the repo task force reports and the FinTrack reports are all very relevant, because they will show you what your risks are and how they are evolving. And if you need to change your kind of internal processes to reflect those risks, that may be the case.
Excellent. Thank you, William. We had a comment in from Nasir, who noticed in one of the early slides, among the suggested screening tools, Refinitiv World Check was not mentioned, and Nasir asks if there are any reasons for that.
I'm sure it's an excellent tool. I haven't used it myself. There are numerous and far too many to mention. I deeply regret having named 3 tools and not more, because I was certain that this question would arise.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, William. We've just had a question in from Ella. How much country-to-country coordination is there in policing sanctions compliance?
I can jump on this one, Neil. A good amount, and we're learning a lot. And in fact, again, I'm going back to discussions I've had with Global Affairs Canada officials, but also what's discussed publicly, including at the various Senate and House of Commons committees by sanctions officials. So there are formal mechanisms in place for that coordination. The emphasis is moving from listing to enforcement in terms of the coordination of enforcement. So we do know that is occurring. We are told that the majority of the coordination is with the United States and with the UK, to a lesser extent the EU, or so we're told. I'm not in those discussions, but that Global Affairs Canada is of course leading them, and that within Canada the sharing of information is growing as well, which is very important. A greater coordination between Global Affairs Canada, the RCMP, CBSA, Finance Canada, FinTrack, and in fact, some of the legislative changes that are going through the Budget Implementation Act, C-47, that Neil mentioned, actually are designed to allow for greater sharing of information as between Canadian government departments. So it's happening more within Canada, but also at an increased level internationally, with regular meetings to try to coordinate both on the listings, but also on enforcement going forward. I suspect that Canada may be seen as a bit of a laggard on enforcement at that table. I suspect that there is a push by other countries to see Canada continuing to do enforcement and actually have some prosecutions public, but I'm not there.
Just to add a quick further comment, I think that this is definitely something where the precedents already exist in other areas. It's been a long time feature in competition antitrust law enforcement. There's an assortment of other areas where you see well-functioning collaboration, mainly amongst a small group of countries that know each other pretty well. The other very notable one is the national security space with, in particular, the Five Eyes group has become quite well known and talked about, but beyond that, there is a number of other channels of enforcement in national security. That's an area where certainly Canada-US collaboration is increasingly significant. And so I think you start to see that those kinds of collaborations are institutionally acceptable and politically acceptable. We are not in a world that we used to be in some time back where Canada and everybody else might be saying our sovereignty is the most important thing, and we don't necessarily want to be seen to be doing the things the U.S. is doing. This is very much, I think, moving in collaborative directions. That said, there are also a variety of real challenges in terms of doing that cooperation properly in ways that respect confidentiality protocols and mutual legal assistance treaties and other things.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Neil. And looking at that time, I think that is a fantastic place to end today's session. I would like to once again thank Neil and William for their time and for their insight. We really appreciate you being with us. And of course, thank you to our audience for your brilliant questions. I know that we had a few in that we didn't have time for, but please do reach out to William and Neil with any questions that you do have that we didn't have time to answer today. A copy of the slides will be sent over to you as well, along with a copy of the recording. But once again, thank you for being with us. Thank you to our wonderful panel. I wish you all a good day and goodbye.